Good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm Chuck Payne. I work for Mike Perry at the Army Heritage Center Foundation. Mike is in Washington tonight at a function, and unfortunately he couldn't be here, so I am sitting in for him. Tonight, of course, we are absolutely delighted to have Dr. Stephen Smith from the University of South Carolina for tonight's presentation. Just to give you a very brief background about Dr. Smith, he is a research professor at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. He has over 40 years experience in historical archaeology, largely focused on military sites of the American Revolution in the South. He has conducted excavations on Francis Marion and American Revolutionary War battlefields, including the Siege of Fort Mott, the Battle of Parker's Ferry, Snow's Island, the Battle of Camden, the Siege of 96, and the Battle of Williamson's Plantation. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, including Partisans, Guerrillas, and Irregulars, Historical Archaeology of Asymmetric Warfare, published in 2019, University of Alabama Press. This lecture is from his latest book, Francis Marion and the Snow's Island Community, United Writers Press 2021, which is available on Amazon. And I'd like to note also that Dr. Smith has a military background. He is a VMI graduate. He was commissioned in the infantry and served in the Army for a period of time. So he has a little bit of experience in that arena. So without any further ado, Dr. Smith, I turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to be doing something a little differently here. I'm, as he told you, I'm a historical archaeologist. Well, what does that mean? That means that I consider myself a historian archaeologist. And what I mean by that is that I look at the past using all forms of evidence, including not just the documentary evidence, but from primary sources and secondary sources, but also archaeology. So I go out into the field and I look at sites and I analyze those and try to figure out exactly what happened, say, in the Battle of Camden or the ambush at Parker's Ferry. This study is about a place called Snow's Island, which is in South Carolina. We'll learn more about that. And it's a little different look because we're going to add some anthropology. If I had time, we'd add some thinking about the myth of Francis Marion, but that's even another lecture practically. But we're not going to be looking at Francis. This is not another Francis Marion biography book. This is about the people who supported him, were under him in military during the partisan period of Francis Marion's career, and what happened to them, how they formed, how Marion operated with them, and how they contributed to the success of the Southern campaign. There was a Loyalist colonel by the name of Robert Gray who described South Carolina in 1782 as a piece of patchwork. And what he meant by that was, by that time, South Carolina could be divided into little places where there were Loyalist strongholds and where there were Whig or Patriot strongholds. And what we're going to look at is one of those strongholds, which is part of Francis Marion the Swamp Fox's most famous, iconic place, the Sherwood Forest of Robin Hood kind of place called Snow's Island. Let me see here. All right, so this is a new perspective, I think, on Marion. If you know a lot about Francis Marion, I hope you'll learn something new. But we want to look at the people who fought under Marion, and we want to learn if there's anything, by looking at that relationship, if there's anything new that we can learn about maybe partisan warfare. And the tools we're going to use are historic documents, folklore, archaeology, in some mythology, and all sorts of anything that's out there that we can analyze, and we'll get into that a little bit more thoroughly down the road here. Okay, in case you don't know who Francis Marion is, the Swamp Fox, he was a Huguenot plantation owner prior to the American Revolution. He was a middling plantation owner. He wasn't some rich, he was probably maybe only had 10, 15 slaves. He was he had a plantation along the Santee River, and he rose. His early career, military career, was as a militia officer in the French and Indian War, when he went into the upcountry to fight against the Cherokee. During the American Revolution, he was elected a militia leader and rose through the ranks from originally captain all the way up to eventually lieutenant colonel and commander of the 2nd South Carolina. And he was in Charleston just prior to the fall of Charleston in 1780. At that time, he became the partisan commander, which of the Williamsburg and Britten's Neck, or Marion County, Marion District militia. And that sort of partisan career lasted, say, from August 1780 to April 1781. In late December of 1780, he was promoted by General Greene to a brigadier general. And as the war continued, he became increasingly more a militia and regular officer, and less a partisan and sort of a guerrilla operating. He was also one of the things that is not emphasized is he was also the district commander after Thomas Sumter left South Carolina militia, and he operated quite well in terms of the logistical commands in the northeastern part of South Carolina. All right, so Francis Marion's most famous part was his Swamp Fox career, and he used all of the typical partisan tactics of rapid mobility. All of his men were mounted. They consisted of surprise attacks, ambushes, hits, and raids. And immediately upon any victory or defeat, they usually dispersed into the swamps in order to hide and not be able to be found. So I use the word partisan, and these are confusing terms, but I use the word partisan because it was the term used at the time. Partisan was originated back in the 17th century as a guards commander. It became transformed into a partisan corps, which is a light infantry or light cavalry. And today we use the word partisan primarily to look at civilians conducting guerrilla warfare, like the most famous are, of course, of those who were during World War II in Poland and Yugoslavia. But it's still the same sort of tactics: guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare. The Army likes to use the new term asymmetrical warfare. And in the colonial times, we use the words insurgency. And some of the academics like to use the word small wars. All of these tactics are very familiar to people who are interested in military, the development of military theory. Sun Tzu, Fabius, Hominy, Clausewitz, Lawrence, Mao, all of these people wrote about these types of warfare. But I use the word partisan because of a quote that I found from Mao Zedong, which is that in order for a partisan or a guerrilla group to be successful, they need two things. They need the support of the local population, and they need a place to rest and recruit and hide. So here is just some quotes from various people who write about guerrilla warfare, and just saying that Marion was totally in control and in sync with this sort of Maoistic kind of needs for success in partisan warfare. And obviously, Marion didn't know anything about Mao, and I have no clue whether Mao knew anything about Francis Marion. But in any case, these are some quotes. And that final quote there is from Nathaniel Greene, the first letter he wrote to Francis Marion, in which he says, we need to keep up this partisan war, this guerrilla warfare, until we can raise an army strong enough to stand against the British. They also need a base camp. They need a place to rest, to recruit, and to be able to find forage and food and come together, train, and that sort of thing. And Mao Zedong has a quote saying the base area is necessary as human buttocks. After exhausting activity, you need to rest on. And if you look at the history of partisan and guerrilla warfare, you'll find almost every one successful guerrillas have these sort of things. They don't last very long if the local population don't support them, and they don't last long if if they're completely on the move, as we like to think of them being on the move. In fact, they usually have one or two camps in which they are able to hide and rest and regroup. All right, so we're looking at two different kinds of things here. We're looking at a cultural thing, and that is the partisan community, which is what I'm interested in looking at. And I defined that as just a local population sharing, providing resources to warriors who are resisting a common enemy using guerrilla tactics. These are usually citizen soldiers. They are not trained soldiers. Most of these gentlemen had some experience in militias, fighting the Indians, but they weren't full-time soldiers. And they have a geographical base, which is, in this case, Snow's Island. And we're going to look then at, so when I came up with this idea, I started thinking about, okay, this is an interesting way of looking at Marion. How do I figure that out? I need to, first of all, I need to prove that there was this community, that it existed. Number two, I needed to, show how Marion used it. And number three, as an archaeologist, I want to see if I can find evidence of that community on the ground. So that's what basically my study is about. Snow's Island, let's define what that is. It is not an island in the traditional sense of being off the coast. It is a highland swamp, and I say highland is that there's some dry areas, but it's completely surrounded by water. It is surrounded to the north and east by the PD River, to the north and west by Lynch's Creek, and then there is this branch of Lynch's Creek that breaks off and called Clark's Creek, which ends up back downstream of the PD River. That area is completely surrounded by water. It's now in big timberland, and it has always been known, if any of you read any biographies of Francis Marion, he is intimately linked by with this location. The traditional thing is that, that famous picture, which you will see in sometime tonight, of Marion entertaining the officer at his camp, is supposedly on Snow's Island. So there's the location of it. It's in the PD River. Generally speaking, it's north of Georgetown and northeast of Charleston. So the region we're going to be talking about is not just the island, but the community of people that lived in that area. And I ended up defining the core region and an outer boundary of people who were influenced and worked with Marion in that location. The key to this area is these 4 ferries. They provided access to Snow's Island. A is Witherspoon's Ferry, B Port's Ferry, and Potato Bed and Britain's Ferry. All of these places provided access, but by controlling these ferries and controlling that, Marion was semi-secure on Snow's Island, and at least he knew what he was doing and where his territory was. Okay, so the first thing I needed to do was to prove that there was a community and that this community worked with Marion. I had to go back through the documents and try to eke out and prove to, this is my dissertation, so I had to prove to my dissertation community, yes, there was a community, it did exist, and it did work with Marion. So I had to go back through the old histories. I used a lot of primary sources, including plat maps, audited accounts, pensions, genealogy. And then I also looked at archaeological sites. Defining that community consisted of looking at these sorts of things, and here are some examples. Also looking at several petitions. These petitions helped me locate people on the ground. So for instance, the Ports Ferry petition obviously signed later, but if we have people who lived on the land prior to that, and they signed a petition to establish a ferry at Ports Ferry, the official ferry, the ferry went back all the way back to the probably 1760s, then that provided first line of evidence that we were going to be looking at various people. Now I'm going to go through these a little bit farther, closer, and just kind of give you a headache of what a historian can get into when they get into the genealogy, for instance. So here's a typical example of William Goddard. William Goddard, Marion supposedly didn't camp out in the middle of the woods. He camped at William Goddard's plantation on Snows Island. So we'd like to know about William Goddard. I get into the records to look at William Goddard, and here his genealogy. We have William Goddard and his mother, and his father was Francis. And there's William Goddard there. And you can see that he had, he was married to the Snows of Snows Island. He had a brother named Francis. And he had a sister named Francis. And then, of course, he had two children, one of which was another Francis. And then Anne and Francis had a William. Now, you go back into these genealogical things, and yeah, you're right. No one ever says William Goddard the first, William Goddard the second, and so on and so forth. So it gets to be quite a puzzle trying to find these people and to fix them on the landscape. The petitions were, as I said, most useful because there's two of them right there, 1776. So I knew these people who signed this petition had to be on Britain's Neck. Britain's Neck is the little location next to Snows Island. Let me go back there real quick. And let's see if I can find it. It's right. Let's see here. It'd be this property right here, or this little area right here next to Snows Island, defined by the PD and little PD. Very important for Marion as a place of hiding also. So I knew I had those people that way. All right, looking at plats, I wanted to put those people on the landscape. Plats, if you've ever used them, are notoriously bad. Many of them float in space. And you remember, if you've ever read them, you'll find that most of them at that time said the sycamore tree at the river, along the PD River, go X number of rods southeast at this angle and to the oak tree and turn northwest and go another 40 rods this way. It's very difficult to do that, but by pinning them on the ground, for instance, this one here, the Dunham family, which will become very important in our story, I was able to at least know that the Dunhams are here, then I can build out from there as we're looking here to be able to connect up, because they usually said somewhere along there adjacent to the Balloon family or adjacent to the Ray family or something like that. And then there, of course, there are plats that have no business at all. This plat here is for James Mickey, who never, ever was on Snows Island. Here's Snows Island right here. But he purchased this property back in the 1760s. He was a loyalist. And after the war, he tried to get some compensation for his loss of land. And so they did a big survey for him and figured out where his land was, although he was never there. Audited accounts. Those of you who may know about those, the Americans gave receipts when they took things from loyalists and from patriots. And these were quite useful because they told me exactly who was providing Marion with materials, primarily pigs, cattle, forage for pigs and cattle, sometimes food. Sometimes it does say food. Sometimes it says ammunition. Sometimes it says slaves. So all of these things are very, very useful. And this one happens to be really exciting because it says Camp Snows Island, January 1st, 1781. Received James Snow 8 head of cattle, 2,000 weight. received for the troops of the command of General Marion. Okay, now that helps a lot. That establishes that he was supporting Marion. Not too many loyalists at this time were being given receipts. Later in the war, they were given receipts, but not at this time. Pension applications. There are thousands of those audit accounts, I should say, and we had to spend quite a bit of time going through the archives looking for them. Pension records, you may know about those too. The American government gave the Revolutionary War soldiers pensions. If they could prove they were in the war, they usually had somebody had to witness what they were doing. And so someone else would sign this along with the pension applicant. And later they expanded that to widows and even expanded it to children. So these pension applications have a lot of interesting information. You have to use them with caution because these are in the 1830s and 40s. So we're talking a long time after the war. And by that time, some of these people were using the earliest historical references of sources to try to figure out where they were. You're imagine yourself a militia guy who knows from North Carolina, he goes to South Carolina for the first time in his life, and he fights in a couple of battles. Does he know really where he was? Was he told? Not so much. So he had to go back and look at some of these histories to figure out, yeah, I was there. Hey, George, was I at that battle? Was that over there on the PD River? Oh, yeah, okay. Hey, didn't we go to that place called Snow's Island? Yeah, okay. So they can provide a lot of useful information. You just have to be careful how you use them. Okay, so by doing all that, I was able to identify people who supported Marion with either as soldiers and provided food, cattle, pigs, forage, etc., assault, slaves, or were civilians only and lived in the area. But all of these people, and I should say, by looking at all these records, all of these people that I'm going to show you intermarried. They went to church together. So I'm looking at church records. They bought property from each other. They sued each other. Sometimes not, a hostile lawsuit, but just simply to get something done. They signed petitions and they joined the militia together. So these people here on the ground, here are some of the people that were most involved and lived in and around Snow's Island. Each one of these people that you see here on this slide, I know exactly where they are on that map. That's where they were. That's where they had property. So Witherspoon's Ferry, again, which will play a big, and the Ports Ferry, I know they had property there beside the Stones, the James family, the Snows family, the Britons family for Britain's Neck. All of these people had property. For instance, Hugh Giles was a militia commander, and he turned his Williamsburg Militia over to Marion when Marion arrived at Witherspoon's Ferry. Nathan Savage was a soldier in Marion's command. He was there the entire war. He is famous for being the one who supposedly fired the flaming arrows at Fort Mott during the Fort Mott siege. Witherspoon and James, the James family, William Dobbin James, the son of these gentlemen, wrote a biography of Francis Marion in 1820, published it in 1824, of his exploits with Marion. So these are the hardcore people. They all provided blood and forage and food for Francis Marion at Snow's Island. I have a second tier of families. These people are located generally in this area. They are interesting for the, so for instance, the Booth, Shaw, Grice all provided Marion with supplies, but somewhere they lived along somewhere here on Warhee Neck. I could never really nail them down. Savage had property farther up also, Catfish Creek. So along Catfish Creek are these gentlemen here. Somewhere on Britain's Neck are those families here that supported and that sort of thing. And then there are third tier families who are, again, Britain's Neck. I got no idea where they lived, but they did provide food, fodder, and pensions, and so on and so forth, and said they fought with Francis Marion. So these are third level families. Now, I did add one person here, Mescali, and this guy is an interesting gentleman. He was hung at Fort Mott. I keep talking about Fort Mott because I also do a lecture on Fort Mott. Anyway, so he was hung by the Americans at Fort Mott after the siege, and Marion captured Fort Mott because he was recognized as a British loyalist and possibly a spy. And it's my theory, though I cannot prove that, the fact that he had property here on Muddy Creek right next to Snow's Island, it indicates to me, since he was a loyalist, that he had been moved out, he took up the loyalist cause, and may have been the one who led the British to Snow's Island in 1781 when Marion lost his camp. All right, third tier families, Marion partisan history. Okay, now we're going to get to Francis Marion. You've all been patient and looked at all kinds of crazy genealogy and stuff. So let's talk a little bit about Francis Marion's partisan career. First of all, I want to just mention the fact of this community and what happened to them prior to the war, what happened to Marion during the war, prior to Marion getting there, Marion and the community and the post-partisan community. As you can see, I'm moving along here rapidly, and yet I'm already 20 minutes into this. All right, so very quickly, this area here was settled much later than most of the places in South Carolina, primarily because the land was rolling, the soils were not very good, and the earliest settlers came in and said, let's settle along the Santee River, and let's settle in the upcountry where the crops are good. A Welsh contingent settled in here and moved north after a while. They just didn't want to live here. But later it started to get filled in, especially when the indigo industry began in the 1760s. People could live in this area because they could grow indigo in the swamps, because it is swampy. And they could live pretty good simply by turning out their pigs and cattle into the swamps for them to forage on their own. And then when they wanted to gather up the pigs and stuff, they would gather up corn, and the pigs would come to the corn, and then they would capture them and take them to harvest. And what they had done was, I think they were part of the regulator movement, which was a movement to try to force the government of Charleston early in the colonial time to extend their government into the backcountry so that they could have, justices of the peace and juries and that sort of thing, and purchase land without having to travel all the way from this area down to Charleston to get records done. And that regulator movement in the 1760s, which was kind of a mini revolution, I think it gave them a clue as to, yes, they could do this. Okay, so they joined the war early. I took these people's names and I looked at them and what they did, and they joined the Continental Congress in 74. They were members of the Continental Association. Many of these gentlemen went to Charleston and fought at Fort Moultrie in 1776. Many of them were sent north to the Craven County, upstate, and sat there for several years with nothing happening between 1774 and 1780. And some of these gentlemen in the fall of in the spring of 1780, when Charleston fell, May of 1780, some of them were captured and paroled back home. All right, Marion, how did Marion get there? How did he become this partisan? Well, he didn't want to become a partisan. He wanted to be a regular line officer, lieutenant colonel, standing up battles against the British. He was there in 1780, right before the fall of Charleston. And if you know anything about Francis Marion, you know that he supposedly broke his leg trying to escape a dinner party. He didn't want to stay all night and drink, so he climbed upstairs, jumped out of a window, either twisted or broke his leg, and became a supernumerary officer. That is, he couldn't perform his duties. So as Charleston began to be closed in by the British, Lincoln told him to go home, and he came back to the Santee River to his plantation. As things got heated, when Charleston fell, he went north into North Carolina and eventually rejoined Horatio Gates' army, the Second Continental Army, to come south. And interestingly enough, he followed with Gates down to the Rugeley's Mill. And on August 15th, the day before the disaster at the Battle of Camden, August 16th, a messenger came from the Williamsburg Militia, who were camped here at Witherspoon's Ferry. And they said, please send us an officer. And Gates was happy to discharge Marion, whom he did not have a great affection for. And Marion and Peter Ory, his subordinate, and about 20 men traveled to Witherspoon's Ferry and took charge of the Williamsburg Militia. The Williamsburg area is right here. They would later be joined by Hugh Giles on the Marion District Militia. Now, what these things represent here is various places that Marion went to and then retreated back to this area, the Snows Island area. So, for instance, in August, shortly after the Battle of Camden, he sent his men. He sent Peter Ory down state, and he himself went down to the Santee River with the idea of burning all the boats on the Santee River, believing that Horatio Gates was about to destroy Rawdon and Cornwallis at Camden, and that the British would have to fall back to Charleston, and by burning all these boats, he would be able to hold the British Army against the river. They couldn't get across. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Marion went to Murray's Ferry, chased off the British Guard, then went over to the Great Savannah area here where Colonel Thomas Sumter's plantation was, and heard about the disaster at Camden, but that 150 Continental officers or Continental soldiers were coming south as prisoners of war back into Charleston. He ambushed that prisoner of war train. 150 soldiers were rescued. A lot of them said, "To heck with this, I'm tired of this war," and went. And about half of them said, "I'm going to Charleston anyway." The other half went to Hillsborough, and a few of them joined Marion. All right, and then he retreats back to the Snows Island area. He camps around Ports Ferry. He starts beginning to talk about the Snows Island area as a depot. He fights a skirmish at Blue Savannah, wins that battle. He makes a foray south into towards Indiantown. There he finds out the British have gathered up and are after him, so he retreats back and then retreats into North Carolina. And then a gentleman by the name of James Weems conducted a raid through this area, burned out many of the Snows Island people and their plantations, and that turned out to be Marion's best recruiter. Many of those people who were sitting on the fence decided to join Marion, and so Marion comes back into town, the Snows Island area, and conducts a ambush at Black Mingo, where he defeats Loyalists there at the Battle of Black Mingo. Okay, let's see. All right, so, and then there's a series of other skirmishes, and what I'm not really going to have the time to go through all these, but the point is, even through these things, each one of these little things, there are activities in which Marion forays out and then has to go back to this area and uses this area as the camp and the resting area. And the British are not able to really have it. Everything else is going on. We got Sumter running around the backcountry, so they have to chase him also. So Marion is fairly well protected. The first evidence of being on Snows Island is under Hugh Giles, when Giles gathers up some ammunition and takes it to the island. And then Marion is first evidence of him being there is the 28th, but I'm almost positive he was there much sooner than that. He was camped there from the 28th to the January 20th. During that time, they construct various redoubts and they fortify the place. Lee arrives in January of 1781. They go on to attack Georgetown. And then because Nathaniel Greene is forced into North Carolina and is chased by Cornwallis across the North Carolina landscape in the Race to the Dan, Rawdon, Lord Rawdon, is free to try to get at Marion finally without disturbance. And he goes after Marion by sending a two-pronged attack against Snow's Island. The first of these was Watson, Colonel John Watson, who started out along the Santee River. Here's his route, an attack. His idea is to go from Fort Watson, which is about right here, and to follow this route to get to Snow's Island. Unfortunately, Marion hits him, ambushes him at Webu Swamp, falls back to Mount Hope Swamp. Watson continues forward, gets hit again, makes a right turn, goes up to Lower Bridge, thinking he can cross here to get towards Snow's Island. Marion is outfoxed there. He immediately runs his infantry, mounted riflemen on the other side of the river. They stop Watson. Watson retreats to Witherspoon's and Blakely's plantations, rests and regroups, decides he's beat up too bad to continue towards Snow's Island, and makes a running retreat all the way back into Georgetown. Marion just about has him trapped there on the Sandpritch Bridge. Unfortunately, while that was happening, Colonel Doyle from Camden came into the area and attacked Marion's camp on Snow's Island. After the Battle of Snow's Island, Marion didn't really use Snow's Island very much anymore as a camp. The reason wasn't because he couldn't get back there. The reason was because General Greene came back into South Carolina to continue the campaign against the British. And from about April of 1781 until the rest of the war, Marion and Greene were on the offense, attacking the British and capturing the various outposts and eventually forcing the British back into Charleston. So Snow's Island was no longer needed. However, the people there reconstituted themselves and continued to provide beef and cattle and other kinds of sundries for the Continental Army. All right, I need to move on to the archaeology. Well, do these places exist? You darn right they do. I went to every one of these places and found evidence of colonial evidence, and in some cases, definite evidence of Francis Marion. We found the Battle of Black Mingo. We have not found the Battle of Blue Savannah, but we have an area which we are searching, and we're coming down with enough materials that we think we're close. Port's Ferry, Goddard's Plantation, we found. Witherspoon's Ferry has been destroyed by development. Birch's Mill, a place where he signed a treaty up here, has been found. The tan yard was a defensive position here, which has been found. And most importantly, Dunham's Bluff. Dunham's Bluff may actually be the camp on Snow's Island. There's a lot of early 19th century confusing evidence that this place was actually Marion's camp rather than on Snow's Island itself. And as you can see, it's across from Snow's Island. This is an atlas done in 1825, and you can see there that Marion's camp is listed there. There it is right there, and you'll see what we found. We found cannonball, a silver sleeve button with a regimental eye, first button. We found lots of lead shot. It's right here, little bend port right here. Candlestick holders, we did quite a bit of excavations and found evidence, lots of evidence of things. They had oyster shells, they had lots, Marion's men were not starving. Do not think that Francis Marion's men were living in the swamps, eating sweet potatoes as the story goes. Marion's men were doing quite well with the pig's forage and everything else he had, including they were eating oysters from the ocean. They were picking them up in the marshes and so on and so forth. Here is some evidence possibly of a fortified structure. We don't, this is a profile of a ditch that was dug. We didn't have time to dig it too far, but it is a profile showing a trench going in this direction. And we can't think of that. That's the size. It's probably about, oh, I would say 20 inches, 15 inches across and 30 inches deep. Colonial artifacts, lead shot, all of this leads us to believe that we had the place. Down on the river is a old bluff, old redoubt that Marion's men built during the, to protect the access to Snow's Island, which is across the river. There's the river here. And we put a profile through it, and there you can see the dirt piled up. And this level here is the living surface during the time when Marion was there and piled up stuff on top of the dirt to create this this ridge, or it's actually a three-sided little redoubt. Here's just a strategic profile, and there you can see the ridge there. We even got a carbon date that dates to about 1600, and you know that's early, but that fits within the realm of what carbon-14 can do accurately. They don't really get down to the date, that sort of thing. We have found Goddard's Plantation, which consists of two different structures, posting ground structures, very typical of that period of construction. And there was evidence of colonial period there, and very much so that this was probably Goddard's Plantation post-revolution, but there are ceramics there that were dated to the early part of the war, dated to the American Revolution. Black Mingo, we found that battlefield. Here is military equipment, lead shot, arms, flintlock musket arms, ramrod pipes, bayonet scabbard, and lead shot. We have the Black Mingo battle nailed down also. Blue Savannah, as I said, we didn't really find much on that. I'm not confident of that one. It was a running skirmish, and consisted of a running skirmish and then an ambush. And we have not found, I don't think, sufficient evidence, but we have found some lead shot and buckshot. Ports Ferry, we found military arms. This is a sea service side plate for a British musket. And we have found evidence at all these different locations. Hickory Hill is a location near the Britain's Ferry, which had colonial materials on it. There is a British camp here. We have, of course, Dunham's Bluff. We have not found anything on Snow's Island. It's been quite difficult to find that, but all those sites have been found. All right, I'm going to give you some conclusions now. I didn't realize how much I could talk, and it is 7:44, so I want to give you all a break, but just some quick conclusions. And then what I found is that Marion and the community acted together in a symbiotic relationship. Marion provided legitimate authority of these guys being connected to the larger revolution. Without Marion there, they were just banditti, and that's what the British thought they were. But Marion was connected through his lineage and through his authority as a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army to connect him to the greater cause. He provided security in the form of again, the connection to Greene's army. He located salt. Salt was an important commodity. For some reason, the colonial South did not make their own salt. They imported it from Bermuda. And when the British captured the South or closed up the South, of course, salt went away. So Marion's men had to make their salt by going down to the sea and getting sea salt in big, large pans. It's a very laborious thing, but he'd get that, he'd capture that, and then he would distribute it to the good guys in his community, the people that supported him. He would distribute that, and that was extremely important for the preservation of beef and also digestion. Without food, without salt, if you're a salt deficient, you're having some issues digesting your food. Ammunition and also slaves. The community provided blood and warriors, beef and forage in the form of corn and corn sheaves for the pigs to eat. They also, in the early part, provided ammunition to Marion and slaves. So I think from the regulator experience, this early rebellion against the colonial government, they learned that they could resist authority. And they joined the Whig resistance early, and they used their pre-community structure to the church, the kinship, and ethnicity on the community members were organized into a movement. The rich and famous, the James, the Witherspoons, the Giles became the commanders, and they were the prominent communities and the families, and they probably early in the war sort of told the Loyalists, you should move on. How did the community was used by Marion? Marion did not come in and kill everybody and start a new structure. He inherited a political order, a military order, and he simply absorbed that into the larger Whig resistance and provided that authority and validation of their conflict. He controlled the civilians through the distribution of supplies and giving of receipts. He restricted his warfare against civilians to gain support. He fortified the region, but weakly. And he was often forced by his own men to do things he didn't want to do. The Blue Savannah battle is a perfect example. Two of the Munderland brothers wanted to go and save their father, who was in the Blue Savannah area. And so they went to Marion and said, we need to rescue our father. He's being harassed by the Loyalists. And Marion said, well, look around. We got 25 guys here. What are we going to do? And they said, well, we're going to go anyway. And so Marion said, okay, let's round up what we can and we'll go. And he went and he defeated two individual commands. Is there any examples of, is there any evidence of this partisan community? Well, I was amazed how much there was. We found camps, we found redoubts, farms, plantations, the ferry crossings, but no single camp. But they are rather ephemeral, and we have to need to know where they are and need history. We can't just simply find them on our own. And surprisingly, there are readouts there, there are architectural features that still exist today. Okay, and then some self-promotion there. All of this in greater detail can be found at this book on Amazon if you're interested. And I apologize for going all the way almost an hour here. Thank you.
Not at all. Not at all, Dr. Smith. We're now ready to start with some questions, and we've got a couple of them. So let me go with the first one. The question is, what does Snow's Island look like today? Are there any markings?
Yeah, well, part of the reason why we haven't found anything on Snow's Island is because it is a complete and utter mess. It is owned by a timber company. And they manage it for timber, and they also lease it to hunters. So they now grow slash pine on it, and slash pine is rapidly growing. And when they cut it, it's clear. It's difficult to do any searching unless we can get them to clear it. And then it grows up into weeds, and it's impossible to search. So we have been on the island. We have searched the northern part of the island where most resources say that's where he was. We have found absolutely no evidence of him. We need to search the middle of the island. When that might happen, I don't know. Another thing, it's fortunate but unfortunate, is that there was a major drought in the 90s, and that whole area dried up, even the swamps that were very rarely dried up. And so some of that swampy area that looked like the time that Marion was there, these large oaks and that sort of thing with the you can see this picture here of Marion and all the moss growing out, that sort of vista or landscape. There were parts of that in the 90s that looked like that still. But unfortunately, they were able to get their trucks in there. And so they took out all those very valuable hardwoods. So right now it's a mess.
I understand. This is a very interesting question, germane in many ways. Were there any Black or American Indian soldiers that fought under Marion?
One of the most famous quotes we have of Francis Marion's men was a quote by Otho Williams when Marion arrived in camp, when he had, as I said, he had been released from command in Charleston, and he went north to Hillsborough to join Gates's army. And we arrived at Gates's camp, and Alpha Williams said, "Marion arrived recently, gentlemen. His men were some white, some black, all mounted, most miserably equipped." So they were, and then he goes on to say that the Continental soldiers made fun of them because they were so ragtag. Yes, he had, and there are pension applications from black who say they fought under Marion. Also, there were slaves there, obviously, and the famous picture, of him there at in the British. He's entertaining the British officer. You see his slave Oscar. Supposedly, that's who he is. Was cooking the sweet potatoes. Yes, there were black soldiers, and there were also slaves. It's just difficult to know if they were volunteers or not. There were also Catawba Indians, and in records at that time, Catawba Indians were often called people of color, so that also confuses the issue. And of course, the British rounded up slaves and made them into British dragoons. And Marion fought the British dragoons at a battle at Wadbu Plantation at the very end of the war in August of 1782. So it's a very complex issue, but yes, there were African Americans fighting under Marion.
Okay, well, the next question leads into that, and I don't know if there's anything else to add, but one of the attendees said, what about the indigenous people by that time?
Say that again.
What about the indigenous people by that time? Anything else to add?
Yeah, well, the Catawba were fairly loyal to the Patriot cause. The Cherokee obviously were not, and there were expeditions into the backcountry to try to root them out. There were a couple of those during the Revolution. They largely joined the British forces as the lesser of two evils, I guess, from their perspective. And it was that warfare was just as bloody as what was going on in the partisan warfare in the Low Country. As I said, there were some Catawbas that fought under Marion and fought in other militia units. They're difficult to identify, again, because if the Catawba have fairly good genealogy and they can trace back their own, but trying to find them any other way it's very difficult.
I understand. I would argue that there might be some scholarly possibilities following up on some of his followers.
Oh, absolutely. There's lots of room for research. There's a gentleman by the name of Tortuga that's doing research on this period of time with the Native Americans and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is, how large is Snow's Island?
It's about 3 miles long by 2 miles wide at its widest. It's about, you figured out how many square miles that is. It's a pretty big place.
Okay. So more than adequate to hide his force.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Next question is, did Marion fight alongside Light Horse Harry Lee?
Yes. 2 different campaigns. The first campaign was in January. At the end of January, he and Marion Greene detached Lee to join Marion, and they went after. They tried to attack Georgetown. Georgetown was a target that Marion only really wanted to capture. He felt that was an important seaport. And it turned out to be he was correct. In 1782, after they did finally capture it, it was the main port for supplies to the Continental Army. I mean, they funneled a lot of supplies through there. So they attempted a kind of an amphibious attack and a land attack coordinated, which didn't go well. Marion was never strong enough to really attack Georgetown and capture it. And the British were smart enough that every time Marion tried to do a raid, they would just get into their fortifications and wait him out. Because once he entered the town, he only had some rifles and some muskets, and he could shoot all day at them, and they could just kind of wave at him.
Right.
So nobody had any artillery. So they did, that was an unsuccessful attack. The second time was in April, when Nathaniel Greene returned to South Carolina after he had defeated, well, I say it was a defeat at Guilford's Courthouse. The British claim that it was a victory for them, but it was a bloody victory, and they ended up retreating to Wilmington.
Right.
Instead of continuing to chase Cornwallis, Greene turned around and came into South Carolina. At that time, he again detached Lee and Marion. They went on to capture Fort Watson. They attempted to delay John Watson. Remember that gentleman who tried to attack Marion's camp at Snow's Island?
Right.
He was still in Georgetown at that time, still in April. And so they tried to delay and attack him. They missed him. He was able to elude them. They crossed the Santee River, and then they went north and attacked Fort Mott. After Fort Mott was captured, Lee went north to capture Fort Granby, and Marion was released by Greene to go after Georgetown again. And at that time, he finally captured it.
Thank you. Next question. This regards the cover you have up. The question is, didn't the British officer in the painting give up his commission after this meeting with Marion?
That's the story. The story is from the biography of Mason Locke Weems. I will try to do this without going for another hour, but let's just say I have a whole chapter on that. But that was the first biography of Francis Marion. It was the same gentleman who wrote the first biography of George Washington, who had George Washington cutting down cherry trees and throwing silver dollars. So you get the idea. One of those stories is of the British officer who entered Marion's camp, saw what Marion was living off sweet potatoes, and went back to Georgetown and said, I can't fight against these people. They're living in the swamps. They're doing everything. What are we doing? And resigned his commission and went back. I don't know who that gentleman would have been. The only officer that was in Marion's camp was a Cornet Thomas Merritt, who was put in stockade at the time.
That's a great story. Okay. Regarding Marion, the next question: does he have living descendants?
No. He did not have any children. He married late in life to a widow, and they had a couple of years, maybe 10, 15 years. He attempted to adopt his nephew by the name of Dwight. I can't think of his last name, but he went to quite a bit of trouble to get this young man to pay for his education in Philadelphia, to try to get him to adopt his own name, Marion, so he could carry on the name, and that never worked either. But no, he did not live any. All the descendants who claim their aunts there are no direct ancestors of Francis Marion. There are Marions who are related, brothers and sisters and that sort of thing. Job and Benjamin Marion had children and that sort of thing, but Marion himself had no children.
Okay. The next question is rather lengthy, and here it is. Ranging as a tactic dates all the way back to Benjamin Church and King Philip's War in 1675. Robert Rogers is the most famous ranger prior to the American War for Independence. How does Francis Marion differ from Church Rogers, and the Over Mountain men that fought at Kings Mountain? How does he differ from those?
Oh boy, that's a good question.
Probably a lengthy answer too.
Yeah, no, I won't try because I don't really know. Both were using the same sort of tactics. Robert Rogers was, well, I don't know that much about Robert Rogers. He actually was down in South Carolina, and they may have met for all I know because they were both on the same 1760 campaign. However, you know, when I think of Robert Rogers, I think of primarily him being a regular officer who used guerrilla tactics. And Marion was like that also. But Marion was using, especially these partisans, were civilians who had some militia training. And the biggest problem that Marion had was keeping them there. They came and went, and it didn't matter if there was a victory or they got defeated. They would go off and hide, go home and find out how the family was doing, check on their crops, and come back. Robert Rogers never, I don't think he ever had to deal with that. Maybe he did, but you know, his soldiers were soldiers, and they were trained in guerrilla irregular tactics would be a better word for him, rather than guerrilla tactics. And of course, he wrote the famous rules of that sort of Indian warfare and that sort of thing.
Okay.
As far as the Over Mountain men, that's much closer to Marion's men, in the sense that those guys were really backcountry woodsmen who were primarily using rifles and were crack shots and were used to rugged individualistic life in the way backcountry of the Appalachian Mountains. Some of Marion's men were elites and were, you know, they probably didn't have too many prior to the American Revolution, didn't have a lot of experience except going to a militia meeting. But, you know, in those days, going to a militia meeting meant, you know, gathering together and spending about 10, 15 minutes doing some drill and then going to the local tavern. So, you know, that's about as far as I can go with that without getting into more and more detail. I hope that comes close to an answer.
I understand. Thank you. Okay. Here's an interesting one. This participant says, loved the Swamp Fox series that Disney produced. If you're familiar with it, how historically accurate is it?
Well, first of all, I love it too because it's Leslie Nielsen, and when I see it, you can occasionally find some of them on there. It's hard to not just simply start laughing because you remember Leslie Nielsen went on to a fabulous career as a comedian.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
His movies are great, so I keep thinking of. It would have been great if Leslie Nielsen would have been able to do a sort of a spoof on his own Francis Marion episodes.
Yeah.
Those episodes were based on Robert Bass's book, which is one of the foundational books of Francis Marion biographies, written in 1959. And Robert Bass was supposedly was on set as a consultant for that series. You know, you look at the uniforms aren't accurate. They're using very simple kinds of uniforms and that sort of thing. And I doubt if any of Marion's men had uniforms except Marion himself, and his wasn't. It's pretty ratty. As far as the episodes, they were all taken from the book. I can't point to one episode or the other and say, oh, that one was fake or that other one was fake. I would not place any reliance on the Patriot movie. That is not well done in any sense.
Okay. Here's one for you. During the time that Marion is in the area that you've talked about tonight, conducting these operations, do the British try to employ on their side any kind of either irregular units or irregular tactics to try to thwart him?
Yeah, a lot of the people he fought against were loyalists, and the ranks were filled with people who were just like Marion's men. So they knew the same tactics. I think Marion was fortunate in the sense that he had enough spies out, and it was a very difficult place to get to that he could hide for that period of time. And the British were dealing not only with Marion, they were dealing with Thomas Sumter, they were dealing with Andrew Pickens and other militia commanders. So it was very difficult to get enough people together to go against him. There was a loyalist militia commander by the name of Micaiah Gainey, who had troops in just to the north and east of Marion, who used to go into that area and raid that area, Snow's Island area, the Britain's Neck area, and conduct raids when Marion wasn't there. And he fought against the loyalists at Blue Savannah. That was a loyalist against Patriot, and they were both using the same sort of tactics of ambush and that sort of thing. So yes, they weren't successful at it. The British, of course, on the strategic front, came south because they believed that there would be, if they put regular troops down there, there would be lots of loyalists who would join up. When they got there, they had some, but they didn't have anywhere near the numbers of people that were willing to join the British forces. So they never really had, the mass they needed, one of the principles of warfare, to really get it at Marion. And so it was a lot of stalemates, that sort of thing, for quite a long time.
Well, wonderful. Well, that concludes the questions I have for you at this time. Do you have any other comments or anything you'd like to leave us with before we close?
No, I thank you very much for the honor of being here. I've been wanting for a long time to expand my research into with veterans and with other people connected with the U.S. Army, and this has been fantastic. Usually I have an audience full of archaeologists and or maybe DARs and that and various community resources, which are all good and I love to do it, but I'm very, very happy and very honored to have spoken to you all. And as I said, I can talk about a little more military things of the Parker's Ferry skirmish and battle and ambush by Francis Marion, and also the siege of Fort Mott, if you're ever interested, and also the Battle of Camden. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you all again.
Well, thank you so much. I tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed this. Needless to say, this is something that goes back to the very foundation of our country, and that type of warfare is just as germane today as it was then. And I for one, particularly appreciate everything that you spoke about and found it quite informative. So on behalf of all of us, Mike Perry, everyone at the AHEC Foundation, on behalf of our listeners, thank you so much. For all those of you that participated tonight, thank you so much for coming. Wish you well. Dr. Smith, again, thank you.
Thank you.